I'm 65 years old. I've been riding motorcycles for over 47 years and I've owned over 35 motorcycles, 14 of which have been Triumphs. In 1972 I was walking around the estate where I lived and came across a 1968 Triumph Bonneville parked outside a flat. It was a thing of great beauty, and from that instant I was hooked. It was to be another 25 years before I actually owned my dream bike, a T120 from 1967. It had belonged to a mate of mine, Steve, who had restored it. He'd done a really good job, spent a lot of money on it, but grew tired of it because he had a lot of bad luck. The engine had nipped up on him when he'd been out on it after a very short time, and I think he'd got frustrated with it, so I picked it up for a reasonable price. It was painted in 68 colours, even though it had been built in 67 but registered in 68, so I changed the colours to the 67 colours of deep purple and white. I forget the correct colours for it, or the names of the correct colours, but I changed the colours and did a little bit of work on it, and it was reliable. It was so reliable that my wife Helen and I toured Ireland on it, but I found that when I rode it, I rode it with a chip on my shoulder. That is to say that if I came across a modern bike, I'd need the rider of the modern bike to know how quick the Bonneville was, and consequently I realised after a while that every time I was going out on it I was hitting 100 miles an hour. Long story short, I sold it to a fella from London, and I missed that bike, so about 3 years later I thought I'd give him a ring and see if he ever wanted to sell it, whether he'd consider selling it back to me. And lo and behold, he said, well, I am in the process of selling it to my brother, but he hasn't come up with the money, so you can have it if you want it. So I bought it back. I kept it for a short while, a very short while, because by then I'd had a few modern machines and I'd forgotten how much the old Triumph vibrated, and it wasn't long before I'd sold it again. Now, that Bonneville wasn't my first motorcycle, it wasn't even my first Triumph, but the T120 had been my dream bike, and that was when I realised my dream. After a succession of modern bikes from Honda, Suzuki, BMW, modern Triumphs, I was out one day on a CBR 600 with a friend of mine who had a 1966 Triton, and we had a bit of a race, you could say, and of course I led him for dead on some of the straights. But he took me down a country lane that he knew and I didn't, and proceeded to rub my nose in it. His 1966 Triton, I couldn't get over how well he rode it and how well it handled. I couldn't keep up with it. So I decided I had to have a Triton. So I bought myself a Triton project, and I built it, and over 15 years I developed it. I raced it for a while, but I ran it alongside modern bikes because I was under no illusion that for pure comfort you can't beat a modern bike. Interestingly, the furthest I've ever been on a motorcycle in one go is only 333 miles, but I did it on that Triton when I went to a Triton rally in Brittany in France. For those who don't know what a Triton is a homemade motorcycle based on a Norton featherbed frame from the 1950s or 60s, and with a Triumph engine, either pre-unit or unit, usually from a Bonneville, either a 650, a 500 or 750, and they were so successful in racing because they handled so well. The featherbed frame that Norton came out with in the, I think it was the 1940s it was designed, handled like it was on rails. It was a real rapier for the road, and even now Triton is still a pretty useful tool. For anyone who's interested, I do have a video on YouTube of that bike, the video I made years ago. So anyway, enough of this rambling. what's all this got to do with the Royal Enfield Interceptor or the GT Continental? Well, the GT Continental is the closest thing there is to a modern version of my Triton. Whilst the engine doesn't have all the performance of the Triton, what it does have is far more usable. I think the handling is every bit as good as the Triton, and I will have to concede that the brakes are better than the Gramica 4-leading shoe that I had on my Triton. And aesthetically it's very similar. It's almost as pretty as my Triton. The only other modern bike that to me encompasses everything that the Triton had would be the Triton Bonneville. Now the Triton Bonneville is leaps and bounds ahead of performance in both the Triton and the Royal Enfield. Now these Enfield 650s, the Interceptor and the GT Continental, must be the most reviewed bikes of all time. You could spend a day, possibly a week, looking at reviews on YouTube of these bikes. But a lot of those reviews will be made by people who have borrowed one from a showroom as a demonstrator for a day or an hour. So what is the Interceptor or the GT like to live with? How can we explain the success that these bikes have had on the marketplace? Surely everybody can't be wrong. One of the main reasons why this bike is so successful is its lack of focus. It's an all-rounder. You can't be focused in one direction to be an all-rounder. There is no aspect of the GT Continental or the Interceptor that could be described as brilliant. It does everything competently. Sure, it could use better brakes. Sure, it could use better suspension. Sure, it could use more power. You will always find people searching for more power whatever they ride. There are people out there now fitting turbochargers to Suzuki Hayabusas. One of the attractions of the GT Continental is the fact that it is so improvable. A lot of people who buy them seem to spend half their time improving the bikes. My own machine is fitted with a DNA air filter and power raid silencers. Now, if there is any difference in the performance, I certainly can't feel it. I know a lot of people claim that there is, but I'm afraid I think that that's wishful thinking. There's at least one instance on YouTube where a couple of Indian lads have put a standard bike up against a modified bike, similarly modified to my own, and the standard bike has actually been faster. Personally, I think if you want to make improvements to your Royal Enfield, I would concentrate on the aesthetic. One place where Triumph have definitely got Royal Enfield beaten is in their colour schemes. Some of the colour schemes on the Interceptors leave a little to be desired. The bike itself is brilliant, but there's little imagination gone into the colour schemes. I personally went ahead and put my money where my mouth is. I think that the Baker Express colour scheme is best suited to the GT Continental, and I've painted mine accordingly. The jewel in the crown of the Interceptor and GT is the engine. Royal Enfield have rewritten the rule book with this engine. It's only 47 brake horsepower, but don't let that fool you. This bike produces 85% of its torque below 2,500 revs. That makes it extremely rideable. If you have any reservations as to whether 47 brake horsepower is enough for you, think. When I look back at many of the most fun bikes I've owned, they've all been around the 50 brake horsepower mark. I had a CCM R30, which nearly killed me. The Triumph Bonneville, 47 brake horsepower. My Triton, around 55 brake horsepower. I had a little Honda 400 Super 4 grey import, which was 53 brake horsepower. These are all machines that you could have a lot of fun on. Many of the more powerful machines that I've had, Fireblades, etc., have been extremely fast, to the point where when I look back at some of the rides I had on those machines, they've been more about terror than pleasure. This reinforces the old maxim that it's better to ride a slow bike fast than a fast bike slow. The torque curve on the Enfield is creamy, such as it is. And when I look at rides that I've enjoyed, that I've videoed across the Black Mountain, I look at the rev counter and it seldom goes anywhere near 6,000 revs, and I'm riding very spiritedly at those speeds. So this is a very understressed engine. It's also incredibly smooth for a twin. Occasionally you get a little buzz through the handlebars just to let you know that it is a twin, but this is not a bike where vibration is going to wear you down. What little vibration there is just serves to remind you that you are riding a motorcycle and not a simulator. The bike will potter along nicely at 2,000 revs as long as you're gentle on the throttle. Nowhere in the rev range does it become raucous or uncomfortable. It's happy to rev, it's happy to potter. There is a slight step in power at 4,000 revs. If you're riding spiritedly, I tend to ride between 4,000 and 5,000 revs. I get a little annoyed when I hear people say, oh yeah, it's a good bike for the money. It's not a good bike for the money, it's a bloody good bike. People are always going to compare it with something else. That's the nature of people. And the nearest thing to it would be a T100 Bombville, which, is it fair to compare a 650cc motorcycle to a 900? Well, no, not really. Is it fair to compare a motorcycle that costs £6,000 to one that costs £10,000? No, not really. You're not buying a Triumph Bombville, you're buying a Royal Enfield GT Continental or an Interceptor. If you're expecting 900 performance from it, you're going to be disappointed. But if you look at this machine as it stands on its own, it's unbeatable. There is nothing else on the market that's going to give you as much pleasure as this bike for as little money. Every bike is a compromise in some direction, and virtually every bike is made down to a price, at least mass-produced motorcycles are. There isn't a bike out there that can't be improved in some direction. But in my opinion, Royal Enfield got the engine in these bikes spot on. It's a very simple design, like the early Hinckley Bombvilles. It's oil and air cooled. But unlike the early Hinckley Bombvilles, where the valves needed to be adjusted by shims, valve clearances are simple and performed in the same way as you would on a 1950s or 60s motor car, with a lock nut and a rocker arm. Royal Enfield fitted these bikes with a 525 chain, a chain normally fitted to much bigger machines. Consequently, the chain seems to last forever. In 10,000 miles, I think I've adjusted my chain 3 times. This indicates again another belt and braces approach from Royal Enfield. There doesn't seem to be any need really to fit a 525 chain to this bike, and Royal Enfield seem to have realised that, because the new Super Meteors and the Shotgun have gone down to a 520 chain. This reminds me of the early Hinckley Triumphs, where Triumph were trying to establish themselves as a quality manufacturer and over-engineered everything. I think Royal Enfield have adopted the same tack with the Interceptor to get away from the reputation of the old bullets. When the Interceptor was introduced, a similar belt and braces approach was taken to the service intervals, where the valve clearances were recommended to be checked every 3,000 miles. This has since been changed to 6,000 miles, presumably because the bikes have been out for a while now and it's realised that they don't need that kind of maintenance, which is handy because the 6,000 miles coincides with the oil change interval. If there are any Interceptor owners out there that are unaware of this, check it out. It will save you money on your servicing. Surprisingly, oil filters are expensive in this machine, as they are not made for anything else. You normally find with most motorcycles that there will be an alternative car filter that you can screw on in place. This isn't the case so far with the Enfield. The Enfield takes fully synthetic oil, which is expensive. Interestingly, Ryan49, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's a YouTuber and a scientist, and I would recommend his programs, made a video about the quality of workshop cleanliness in assembling engines by different motorcycle manufacturers. And basically what he did was he asked or invited a load of people who had new motorcycles that when they were due for their first service that he would do the service for them so that he could keep the oil and have it analysed by a laboratory. And the analysis of those oils showed that the cleanest oils of the lot coming out of engines on their first service came from Royal Enfield, and second was BMW. Triumph, I think, was 7th, and Italian motorcycles were not good at all. I would recommend that video if you're interested. It's titled "Which Motorcycle Manufacturer is Best?" and it's by Ryan Fortnite. There's no hiding the fact that the Interceptor is quite a heavy bike. Royal Enfield quote the curb weight as 217 kilos. I don't know what they mean by curb weight. You've got dry weight, curb weight, gross weight, all these weights. I know manufacturers cheat by weighing bikes with empty fuel tanks, with half the oil or with no oil. But 217 kilos, it's not a light bike. The only time that you'll really notice this is when you're taking it off the side stand. Now, there are a number of ways that you can lighten your bike. There are quite a few things on there that are supernumerary and don't need to be there. If you've got an Interceptor, there's the brace on the handlebar, which is purely a styling exercise. I took mine off very early on and was shocked to find that the crossbar is actually bar. It's not tube. Weighs an inordinate amount for what it is and what it does. There's the rear passenger grab rail. If, like me, your occasional passenger doesn't use the handrail, then there's no need to keep it on there. The original silencers on the bike weigh approaching 10 kilos. Norman Hyde claimed that their lightweight silencers will save you 7 kilos. You need to bear in mind also that the original silencers, if you had to replace them, are over 900 pounds each. That's 900 plus pounds in value, not weight. If, like me, you find that unbelievable, go to the Royal Enfield website and check it out. The original silencers contain a catalytic converter, and removing the catalytic converter may offend your social conscience. But in any event, it should be quite possible to remove 8 or 9 kilos in weight from the standard bike. I've heard other reviewers criticise the Royal Enfield for having plastic mudguards. How bizarre! Why would you criticise a bike for having plastic mudguards in this day and age? If you were brought up in the 60s, you'd remember the rust, the corrosion, the chrome pitting that were associated with mudguards of that era. And you certainly wouldn't design a bike now with steel mudguards. But that's exactly what Royal Enfield have done with the new Super Meteor and the Shotgun. I don't know if it's in answer to criticism from reviewers or what. I really can't understand why they've gone back to steel mudguards. If anybody from Royal Enfield sees this and knows the answer to that question, I'd be grateful to be enlightened. The transmission on the Enfield 650s is sublime. It has a very light clutch, which is cable operated. The clutch is a slipper clutch, which helps to make gear changing very slick.
The GT Continental,
you won't find many
and the Interceptor as good a bike as a Triumph Bombville? Well, I think so. I'll grant you that the Triumph is a better finished bike, but then again, it's a better finished bike than just about everything else on the market. Only BMW come close. It does beg the question, how well does a motorcycle need to be finished? I also have a 2023 T100 Bombville. I love the finish on it, but I do wonder how much money I've spent just on that slightly better finish that you get with the Triumph. You get the feeling on the Triumph that you sat on something very special and that nothing else comes close. But as a riding experience, the Enfield is virtually as good. It's only a 650, it isn't going to give you 900 performance. But if Triumph were to build a 650 version of the Bombville, I don't think it would be any better than the Enfield GT Continental or Interceptor.